My name is Jason Gerald, and I work with a great team at NextGen Interactions, and today I'll be discussing our work of exploring VR training with first responders. Who are first responders? Those are firefighters, police officers, and EMS, or emergency medical services. We've been very fortunate to be able to work with a whole lot of first responders. Largely that feedback has come from 3 first responders who we've hired part-time. They've been advising us, giving us ideas of what might be a good fit for VR, as well as correcting us when we're working on things that maybe wouldn't be so useful for first responders. They've also been able to provide us access through introductions and such to a lot of other first responders, which has led to a lot of very interesting one-on-one discussions and focus groups, and allowed us to collect information through questionnaires as well as obtaining feedback of our early prototypes. We've learned that first responding training in some ways is similar to other professional education. They don't necessarily have as much visual audio forms of media, but they do have a lot of discussions with trainers that draw attention to detail. That can lead to challenges because that's kind of giving away the answer, and situational awareness is a big challenge of building those skills that first responders need to get good at. If the instructor sort of telling them what to do, then it doesn't help them in the field when they don't have that instructor. And so those subtle cues are kind of difficult to provide in traditional training. First responders also have a big challenge of gaining experience because those critical incidents are so rare. They don't get to practice them in the context very often. So they do have a lot of theory, but they don't necessarily get to practice those skills every day like other professions have the luxury of having access to. Okay, so now we'll move on to some examples. One of the biggest challenges we found from first responders when we ask them what their pain points are is communication. And so our first responder team member, Blake Boyd, he's utilized a consumer VR game he's been taking to different groups to enhance their communications training. And so the game Keep Talking Nobody Explodes, for those of you not familiar with it, essentially you're attempting to defuse a bomb, and it's a multiplayer game, but not a typical multiplayer game. The other user or number of users are outside of the headset with the documentation and the instructions how to defuse the bomb, but since they can't see what the person is doing in the headset with the bomb, it's extremely challenging. And so they're talking through a radio, which is very similar to what first responders do of communicating through the radio and not seeing what the other person is seeing. We found this is especially good for firefighters due to their competitive nature. We've also found that the most important part of training is not the actual actions themselves within VR, but the discussions after the VR experience where they discuss what worked, what did not work, etc. Our next example is a futuristic firefighter pump panel where we instruct the user to go through and put out a fire in this vehicle in the background you can see here by manipulating the correct dials, setting up the correct pressure, and setting up the correct class of material to put out the fire. Now these pump panels are common in classrooms and such in order to train the user, and this is a variation of that. We also have different versions of our simulated pump panel here of what they might look like in the future. Here the user is interacting by reaching out and grabbing this gauge here that's not only virtual but also matches the physical setup. This is part of what we did at the 3D user interface contest last year at the IEEE VR conference. Here instructions are given through audio as well as on the panel. Then we can also put that on the side of a fire truck. Now, it's typically not a good idea to actually practice training on a real fire truck because that fire truck, if the configuration gets off on that pump panel and a call comes in, that configuration needs to be set up, it needs to be corrected, and that eats up valuable time. And when it comes to fire, time is absolutely essential. And so being able to do that within virtual reality can be done, pretty straightforward, whether the pump panel is by itself or in the context that it'd be used on the side of a fire truck. The next example we have is a law enforcement scenario of a traffic stop that's a lot like you think it would be like. Here you're with another officer and you're instructed to approach the vehicle, and do what you would think you would ask for, asking for the license and registration. The scenario continues on with various steps, and here we're actually doing a physical trunk search where the physical trunk matches the visual trunk in order to look for contraband and such. The next example is monitoring for hazardous materials. This is a gas and air monitoring device that hazmat technicians take out to the field in order to see if there's dangerous gases that are present in these bad situations. Here the user is in the training session of doing what's called a bump test in order to make sure that the device is calibrated before going out into the field. Once they get out into the field, we have various first responders giving a briefing of what the situation is and what the plan of attack is to solve the problem. An instructor then guides the user of going through the basics of performing that bump test in the context of what they will soon be facing of going out to the hot zone and measuring gas levels at different locations at different times. And here is a video of the experience. Here we're using leap motion because we're physically interacting. We can't use control. So we skip the narrative here to go straight to the instruction of this specific piece of equipment.
Okay, we've got our orders. Let's go get the unit ready and head down range. Go ahead and grab your air monitor. Turn it on by pressing the red power button on the right. Once that powers up, you'll see 4 sensors on the screen. As I'm sure you know, those are oxygen, LEL, CO, and H2S. Go ahead and do a quick bump test by putting the meter up to the test cup attached to that cylinder. It's filled with the calibration gas for all 4 of our sensors. Looks good? Then let's head out to the hot zone. Okay, looks like our ride is here. Jump on the back and let's head out.
Okay, they ride out to the hot zone where the user is able to practice using that device in the context of dangerous gases. Okay, up next, we'd like to discuss some of what we've been thinking a lot about of how these XR technologies can best be used for training specific to first responders. And so generally, some traditional training works quite well. We're not trying to replace training, but really supplement the training. We want to use VR for where it has benefit and not use it where it doesn't have benefit, not trying to replace things that already are sufficient and appropriate. Traditional training doesn't allow, or it's typically really expensive to do live action training, and even in live action training you don't have the full context that first responders sometimes find themselves in, and so assessment and performance can be better practiced in the similar contexts. Which leads to simulation fidelity, defined as the degree to which the experience matches the real world. We're not just talking about audio visual here, but the things everyone here at the conference is very familiar with. Low latency, interactions, in our case, physical, tactile, touch. As far as learning goes, we believe active learning with physical interactions versus more passive forms of virtual reality is really essential for many first responder tasks because what they do is so physical. VR also allows for mistakes, so we need to let users be able to do that and do make those mistakes without facing those real world consequences. That is, they can do it in a safe way. Overcoming those mistakes and difficulties engages the mental processes that support long-term retention and transfer to the real world. VR also has the advantage of providing immediate feedback versus where in traditional training that typically happens during debriefing. And training is most effective when providing that feedback immediately after the actual specific action is taken. We also want to provide variability. Research supports that learning concepts from concrete examples is more effective than learning them from abstract concepts alone. However, training with a small number of examples can result in incorrect conclusions, so we really need a lot of examples. On the other hand, repetition and iteration is important. There's multiple levels of knowing, and basic knowledge is not enough to perform under stressful situations. Understanding tasks at an inherent level requires a lot of practice. Some specific first responder tasks first responders have told us they thought would be useful, the VR would be a good fit for would be things like searching for hazards, assessing situations and taking actions based on that assessment, detecting hazardous materials, perimeter setup and security, and dealing with uncooperative individuals for law enforcement, as well as teaching how to use specific equipment in a stressful but safe situations, and also testing the trainee's ability to use that equipment. And communication. We need to be able to support the practice of communication skills in dangerous and stressful situations. We need to be able to support multiple users in collaborative environments as well as simulated characters, and also modeling command hierarchies that are important for first responders similar to the military. Trainer capabilities we need to provide. Really, we need to get better at providing tools for trainers and subject matter experts to use themselves. It shouldn't be the developers creating these scenarios and training, as well as being able to provide the trainers to be able to observe from within VR as well as 2D views. 2D has advantages, VR has advantages, and using them where appropriate. The trainer should be able to adjust difficulty, both making cues explicit, but sometimes they need to be more subtle cues in order to train for situational awareness, as well as providing after-action reviews to be able to discuss afterwards without interrupting performance while they're performing the task. So VR can do things like provide heat maps, we can rewind the simulation, we can do it in slow motion, we can bookmark areas of actions of interest, we can ask trainee questions while the after action reviews paused, and we can also have experts go in there and observe those. Trainees can observe the performance during the after action reviews. And also VR is a tool that allows us to improve our training. And so collection of behavioral data, we can sort of already have the head, hand, and eye tracking, but there's also a whole lot more that can be data that can be collected. Also, ecological validity. Research data is not typically collected in the context of how the results are applied. VR can provide that context. VR can also provide that experimental control to be able to test different factors in a controlled manner by removing those confounding factors that might affect the research. Okay, with that, I thank you for your time, and I very much look forward to the rest of the presentation and get insight from others of how they see these XR technologies will be useful for moving forward on training.